Hi, everybody. Okay, so we know it's a post-lunch crowd, but we'll make this fun for you guys. It's really exciting to be here. We are, as they mentioned, the new kids on the block. But just to get a sense of who our audience is, I thought we'd ask you a few questions before we start. How many of you have heard of podcasts but never actually heard podcasts? No. Okay. How many of you listen to podcasts regularly? So, what are the rest doing? Okay. How many of you listen to Indian podcasts regularly? Okay, so we're going to hope for some converts by the end of this. Uh, like, again, they mentioned we are the new kids on the block, but in many ways, we see podcasting as a sort of natural evolution of radio, and it's great to be here at Tune Into the Future. Podcasting, I think, was in many ways, माइक ऑन है मैं थोड़ा सा और लाउडली बोल दूँ ठीक है थैंक यू सर तो जैसे बोल रहे थे कि पॉडकास्टिंग इज़ द नेचुरल एवोल्यूशन ऑफ रेडियो दिस इज़ रेडियो इन द इंटरनेट एज and like the internet we democratize the way who gets to be heard what we get to say but also like the internet it happens to have large organizations who may threaten to monopolize the area so it'll be fun to kind of discuss this today. I'll let my panelists introduce themselves a little bit but I just want you to know this is a way the whole spectrum of podcasters are here. We have an independent podcaster. We have a radio convert who now runs her own independent podcasting network. We have Aman Goklani from JioSavan, which is primarily music streaming, but Abhi, they're also concentrating on podcasts. We have Sri Raman, who is from a regional content podcast platform. And we have Nishant from Hubhopper, which is a national startup, which is for podcasting. So guys, could you take maybe quick introductions to yourselves so the audience knows what to expect?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here and amazing this panel is just sort of driving the podcast growth in India, I guess. So I'm Nishant and I head sales and partnerships at Hubhopper. Hubhopper is about a 5-year-old startup that believes in the power of audio content. And we work both on the distribution of audio content as well as on the creation and the supply of audio content. Now, we're here at the radio festival, and I mean, someone just mentioned that should radio be threatened by podcasts, and that's definitely not the case. It's just a natural progression of digitization as it has been for TV, for print, for digital. Everything is going to move digital and going to move online, and this is just sort of one more layer of audio that we're going to add. Excited to be on this panel.
Hi everyone, my name is Naga. I run a show called the Passion People Podcast. I'm an independent podcast creator. And on the podcast, I chronicle stories of people who follow their passion because as a very conservative country, I think we need inspiration from people who are already doing this. I'm also part of O2Pod Collective, which is a podcast evangelization and awareness outfit. We run meetups in Bangalore, and that's what I do. Excited to be on the panel with all of you folks.
Hello everyone. Hello everyone, my name is Sri Raman. I run a podcast network called Avas.com. We have about 600 hours of original audio content in spoken word, in podcast, in fiction, in Hindi and Indian English. We believe in immersive storytelling, ad-free experience. So no matter what time of the day your hands and eyes are busy, whether you are in commute or you're trying to relax, there is some kind of content available to suit the mood and time of the day. And we will continue to invest in more Indian languages. That's our bet.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm representing JioSavan here. I'm Aman. So being a music streaming company, the advantage we have is that we have so many people listening to music. We want to try and give them a taste of what podcasts are. And being in this room, I'm delighted that none of you listen to it because that's what the opportunity represents. To us, and this is why all of us are, working our backs off to try and, make you understand what this medium is. It's not that alien. You've probably experienced it in some way or form. I guess we'll talk about it as we progress through the discussion, but I'm delighted to be here.
Hi, I'm May, and I used to be on the radio. So I actually come from a radio background, which is why the great irony that I'm at the radio festival on a podcast panel, because now I make podcasts. So I've been I actually started out as a radio journalist when I was in the UK, and I've been working in radio for over a decade as a presenter, producer, so on. And then I moved into podcasting about 5 years ago when I started making an indie music show. I'd basically get independent artists to come into the studio and do live sessions. Like I've had Rahul Ram on my show, who was, as you just saw, he's awesome. And now I actually run my own company where literally you come to me and go, I want to make podcast. And then I tell you how you can actually do that and help you develop your idea, handle the recording, production, and distribution of your show. That's pretty much what I do with Made in India.
So let's start off with some generic questions. I will ask some more specific questions to give you an idea of, what the podcast industry is, how it is in India. I know many of us are skeptical about what we do. And then maybe there'll be some space for audience questions at the end. So guys, just to give our audience, a size or scale of the industry, what would you say is the audience for podcasts currently in India, and how are you seeing it growing? Aman or May, would you like to take that?
Sure. So, the room represents the fact that too many people are not aware about podcasting, but folks that are aware about it, you guys are hearing a lot of noise about podcasts being the next big thing. There's companies investing, people are talking about it more than ever. All said and done, so the reason this is happening is because people see potential in this medium, and it can be a medium that could take off in the future. So at this point in time in India, I think it's embryonic. That's the word I'd use. It lacks scale, and as I said, I'm repeating myself. This room is a representation of the fact that not too many people are aware about it. So it is a very small medium today, but would it continue to remain small? I personally don't think so, and I think everybody on this panel doesn't believe that. It may take half a decade to a decade wherein it will just be a commonplace thing, and I think people will consume this more than ever before. But as of today, this market is very, very small, but it has immense potential, and it will be. I think the questions 10 years from now would not be would this be a big market, or would podcasts be bigger than what it is? I think the questions will be completely different in that point in time.
In terms of numbers, is there anything we know about how many people are listening, Abhi? How many we expect to grow in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so there's a PwC report that stated that there is 40 million listeners. I personally take that with a pinch of salt. That's the number out there, so you just respect what is out there. But having looked at the hard data and stats of what we see at JioSavan and other companies, it is a very small market today.
It also depends on what you count as a podcast. For example, if the the PMO of the country, who's so good at marketing, he has access to TV, print. He could write op-ed articles or do a YouTube live stream. But the whole point of doing a Man Ki Baat is because audio reaches where TV or smartphones cannot reach, right? So a study indicated that there is 660 million people who have heard Man Ki Baat, and it also comes in 20 different languages. It gets translated, right? So the efforts that is currently going in creating or localizing it audio, non-time sensitive audio content, that's super critical, right? So if we count that as a podcast, then yes, the PwC number looks so small. But if you only go by, the India One, or as we call it, so then 40 million is also a lot in that sense.
So, would you like to say something, May?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I get, and I know everyone on this panel gets that, to understand what a podcast is in the first place, right? Which is literally in the same way that broadcast is moving to on demand, the same thing that's happening in video is happening in audio as well. You can literally call it on demand radio. That's what it is. And I agree with Aman completely that we are in a really nascent stage, but it's like a crest of a wave, right? We're literally riding that right now. And I do think that there is, if you look at the state of radio in India, and I know hope I'm not offending too many people, but if I think that radio is really limited and there aren't enough voices that are being represented on radio as much as you would be able to on a podcast. And I think that's changing, and there are more and more people that might be, even if you have I'm not talking about the numbers. Like you're talking about 40 million. Like we're all like skeptical of that number right now. But that's because that if you have loyalty, like loyalty is what's going to be really different. You have whether it's like I want to listen to a comedy show or I want to listen to Bollywood gossip or I want to listen to something about my health. The way in which people are consuming like podcasting is obviously going to be super different from radio. So I'm going to be listening. I could be listening to 50 hours of like podcasts in a week, right? Or 20 hours of podcasts in a week. It's very different because I'm listening to different shows at different points in time and through different platforms. So it's not like radio where I'm listening to one channel. So even the way you consume it is really different. So measuring an audience like, and right now there exists nothing that tells us how many people are listening to the podcast industry as a whole. So the question that you're asking is practically unanswerable right now.
That's a good way to start.
I know.
We'll get in that a little bit. I think all of, like you mentioned, PM Modi's Man Ki Baat. I think most of us wish we were that. In many ways, we think to ourselves that podcasting is very easy because anybody who wants to access it can be a person with a smartphone and a very basic data plan can hear our podcast, and that's as easy as it is. But itna easy nahi hai. The fact is that we are also perceived to be catering to a certain elite, maybe younger crowd. Do you guys see that changing over the years, or have you, maybe Sriraman or Nishant, have you seen that changing? Do you think there are older people listening, people from smaller areas?
Absolutely, and I think Sri would love to add on that. And I mean, I'll just jump back a bit to the last question that was asked again. And I completely agree with everyone on this panel with the market size. I mean, there is no real market that we can measure today. That's how small it is compared to other markets that are in the content space currently. But having said that, India is and always has been an audio consuming nation, right? We have decades of experience with consuming radio. We're a country who's used to listening to cricket on the radio and cricket commentary. We're listening to the Hanuman Chalisa. We've been listening to the Guru Granth Sahib for years and years, and we've had our ancestors grow up. And we're a country of storytelling. So that's where podcast becomes the potential that Aman was talking about, that there's huge potential in India to even surpass the current markets that are in the US and in China. For us to surpass those numbers with the amount of sort of potential that there is in the market. Now, having said that, podcast is just a nomenclature that has been sort of forced upon the Indian subcontinent. Podcast was originally coined as a combination of broadcast and iPod, and that automatically sort of alienated the whole of the country of India from the content that it consumed. From the Hanuman Chalisa or from the cricket commentary it consumed. Today you can consume that on demand, and I mean the people in this room, there's a market that does not know that it can be consumed digitally. So the term podcast is something that we have to really think about going forward in the market, which is that what actually constitutes a podcast. Is Man Ki Baat a podcast, or is a Hanuman Chalisa that you're even listening on JioSavan a podcast? And in most cases, yes, it is, if you just define it as audio on demand. And that's where we have to sort of start measuring the market from there.
Fair enough. So, okay, I'll stop using the word podcast for now, Sriram. Yeah, I wanted to ask you also because many of us are now warming up to the idea that there is a regional market out there, which is numbers that we haven't imagined. You were, I think, with Awaaz.com, you have that pole position advantage as well. How have you seen that regional audience also grow? And are there things that pop out for them? Are there genres they like better? Are there languages that do better?
Yeah, so when we launched Hindi Awaaz, right, the biggest markets for us continues to be LIP, Lucknow, Indore, Patna, followed by Jaipur. But after some time, we started seeing the Indian diaspora tuning into it. Like there was a good amount of 11% of audience coming from US, which was completely surprising for us. We did not even market our product in US. Now we have listeners from Nepal, Sri Lanka, Middle East, all of it, right? So also Awaaz is available on a $10, 700 rupees KaiOS, the JioPhone. It's available on web. It's available on a Ola Play if you sit back in a cab. So we have made it practically available anywhere on a Fire Stick TV. You can listen to Awaaz on a TV, right? So what we are seeing is, at least our stats indicate we have listeners all the way from 20 to 65. But of course, the 25 to 40 are the biggest chunk, like 60% of the chunk. But there is that long tail of older people listening. And from a genre-wise, humor undisputedly takes the lead, followed by stories, followed by spiritual and devotional.
Could you give us some examples of those as well? What
Yeah,
sort
so
of
for
humor?
example, we have 19-second jokes of Sunil Pal. That's like, it's an outlier in numbers. It's all in millions and millions now, right? Then there is Manto, stories of Manto and Munshi Premchand. All this do very well, right? Then there is like Hanuman Chalisa. So interestingly, Alexa in India, the highest number of times Alexa is used to hear or stream Hanuman Chalisa, followed by Hindi jokes. Once again, that Hindi jokes is ours, right? So humor and devotional is always a huge pull for audio content, right? So when we do this podcast, like I rightly said, it's two people usually conversing. That doesn't do so well in Hindi. It does very well in English. So we see the reverse, right? Because English audience want to upskill themselves, want to learn experiences, knowledge, but Hindi is purely fiction, scripted. It's an audio show, like we call it. We don't even call it as a podcast.
So in terms of the diversity of the people who are tuning in, right? So I think what's happening is, all of us got YouTube installed on the phones when the geo revolution happened and the data came to everyone's phones. The video is something that came naturally, and because video has that stickiness, it pulls you in and it stops you from doing other things, and that's one of the reasons I think video really took off. And really appreciate the work that Hubhopper and Avaz.com is doing, because if they're on if they're on geophones, if they're on devices that people get naturally, I think all of the tier 2 population of the country who are now getting on the internet, the Bharat, right, the people of Bharat, so they are now also going to start tuning in. The problem with them tuning in is the ability to find relatable shows, right? Because content needs to be relatable. It right now you were talking about elite middle class, or middle class people who are affluent, who can understand context. So I can be from Bangalore and I can say that, hey, I'm listening to This American Life, but there isn't an equivalent of that in a Hindi or a Tamil or a Telugu or whatever other language, or even in Kannada or wherever it is, right? So the relatability factor is not there. So access is coming, technology is coming, platforms are coming. Now I guess it's time for the content to catch up. And there's also a lot of people who are now, there's this burgeoning middle class, right? So they're also aspirational and they might also be listening to English, but like Sri said, the stickiness when you listen to your mother tongue on
Could you
radio.
explain stickiness to our audience as well?
Sorry?
Could you explain stickiness?
Stickiness is something that you keep coming back to. So this is something that we've seen as a trend for regional podcasts, because if there's a Kannada podcast called Tale Harte that gets done out of Bangalore, and they get a lot of NRI listens. The reason they listen from outside India is because they're dying to have a connection with India. People who never go to temples in India are building temples and having a society and have a weekly thing there, because what are they really looking for? What they're looking for is a connection back to their motherland, and here is content that hits that chord, and that's what I feel. And so while everything else is there, I think now is the time for us to make that content that has that mass appeal.
So when we speak about mass appeal, I think one question that we all have as soon as we establish our podcast is ki, how do I know if I'm good, or how do I know if I'm successful? And I was wondering, Aman, because you must have been through multiple pitch meetings about this, now how do you quantify that a podcast is successful? Does this also matter? I mean, if it's a celebrity host, is it different? Is it different if it's, say, a cricket podcast? Do those numbers matter?
Well, the question, I'll inverse the question actually. The way I would say that if you are doing something in life, let's just take that as an example. If you're doing something consistently, if you do it every day, the lamest example I can think of right now is going to the gym. If you go to the gym every day of your life, you're going to have those muscles and you're going to have the strength that you need. You stop doing that, suddenly you're going to lose that. I think podcasting is something similar. With podcasting, you need to be very consistent. This is something which is key to podcasting, which most people tend to not understand or miss. So when you're doing podcasting continuously, you're building a base, and that base is where you have the loyal audience, and people keep tuning back to it. They keep listening to podcasts regularly. Now that's the base which counts eventually. Now, if I have to put a number to it numerically, what constitutes a successful podcast or show? I mean, if you are a popular personality, or maybe Three Things, the Indian Express podcast, or something from the Quint or Hindustan Times or whatever that is, if that podcast is hitting somewhere more than 300, 400, 500,000 listens in a month or streams in a month, in India, that I think ought to be a successful podcast. If you're an independent podcaster just starting out, probably more than 10,000 listens or streams in a month is a good number. Again, these numbers should not be viewed in isolation to give you perspective how far probably we are behind or what could be considered as a great metric. I have seen shows globally doing 2 million streams or listens in a month on an episode. So that is 8 million in a month. That's one podcast. And this is not even a podcast which probably is the number one podcast in the world. So from a numerical standpoint, this is where we are. But for you to hit those kind of numbers, the most important thing is consistency. And if you achieve that, just like in everything you do in life, you'll probably be successful over here also.
I don't have the specific stat, but my partner Sean probably does, and I need his help on this one. But there is a company called Liberated Syndicate, Libsyn, and there are, I think they distribute about 80% of like the podcasts in the world. They basically, you upload your podcast there and it distributes to Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and so on. So they have their own podcast, as they should. And they had this stat, I think, where they talked about what makes a successful podcast numbers-wise. And what was the stat? Do you remember?
150 downloads in a month if you're better than 50% of all podcasts.
150
Downloads, yeah. 150 downloads a month means that you're more successful than 50% of the podcasts. Like, yeah, yay on us, which is where you can see, like, that's crazy to think that the biggest distributor on their podcast talked about the fact that 150 downloads a month means that you're more successful than 50% of the podcasts that exist out there.
Just like us, right? We don't need to go to the gym anymore.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to go to the gym anymore. I wanted to ask you now, sorry, we'll get back to you. But another thing we see is that when brands come to us, they want to do super popular mass appeal shows.
Yeah.
Whereas Made in India, now you have your most popular shows are of topics which we would consider niche. There is indie music, which you've been doing consistently over the months, over the years. And now you have the show called She Says She's Fine, which is women's health. And it's very deep into women's health. It's endometriosis, PMS problems. How do you build an audience for niche shows like that? Or is anything too niche?
So this is the thing, and I think that it's like digital media in general, like you're sort of picking on things that you might consider like niche, but I feel like with digital in general, like I don't really think there's anything as niche, because like even if you're talking about, we had like an amazing panel that came on where you had, people working in Sri Lanka and Maldives and Bhutan and so on. And that if I'm going to be doing a podcast in like niche, like in, Arunachal or something like that, does that make me niche? But there's a huge community there that's going to be listening. We're talking about community radio. That's niche. Is community radio niche? Like, so you're catering to interest areas, we're doing news or you're doing indie music. You don't know like where people might like decide what you think might be popular or what won't. If I have like 1,000 people that are going to be coming to me regularly, like doesn't that make what I'm doing every week? I have these people who are coming to me to listen to me and so on and so forth. So what I actually found super interesting about the things that you feel like might be popular or not, you mentioned She Says She's Fine, which is like a women's health show that I produce with a gynecologist. And we covered everything. We covered like sex and contraception and periods and all that stuff. And you think, okay, what would be my most popular episode, right? And you think it might be about contraception or sex. And our most popular episode till date was miscarriages. And it's shocking because we didn't think that would be but it was. And I think it's because those conversations aren't happening, that these conversations don't even happen between a husband and wife. So it was super interesting for me to realize that the thing that you're not, like, you don't know what might become like successful or what might do really well. And I think to like in a space where we're looking at digital, like, man, I'll give you one example, right? Have you guys ever heard of chicken leg piece? TikTok? I discovered chicken leg piece, who is literally one of the most popular guys like accounts on TikTok. Chicken leg piece is literally a guy who takes a chicken leg piece and eats it and says chicken leg piece. And he is one of the most popular people. So what you call niche now, niche does not exist. It's chicken leg piece.
Speaking of chicken leg piece, now a lot of us in, say, more established, we have to start making some money out of it because it gets harder and harder to explain to your parents why you're doing what you are. So the problem is, so when you are trying to monetize a podcast, and we have a lot of skepticism coming in with your numbers are nothing like video numbers. Nishant, I was wondering now, brands and businesses, it can be through sponsorship, it can be through advertising. Why would you recommend that brands and businesses come to podcasts? What do podcasts have to offer them?
Okay. This is sort of the question of the year, I think, is how we're going to monetize this whole industry.
Why should they come to us?
So, I mean, there's lots of potential in podcasts, and the Indian market is warming up to it at the moment. And we've seen it in the past 6 months to 1 year, where we've worked with sort of coffee brands, we've worked with sari brands, we've worked with sort of mattress brands, and they've always they've always limited themselves to the traditional marketing or digital marketing that today has taken off. And audio is a new sort of vertical for marketing and branding for them. It's something they don't understand yet, which is why it's not taken off yet, but there are huge merits to advertising or sort of actually just building an audio vertical in general in your organization. The merits are that today, first of all, in a saturated market like the video market, or the saturated market like the digital display market, your brand needs to stand out. And we've seen that from numerous brands that we've worked with, is that they're always looking for something new that they can sort of market on and advertise on. And that's where podcasting really comes into the picture. And I mean, the podcast space is known. The market in the US is huge. The market in China is huge. It's huge because it offers the engagement and the loyalty that your listeners hold to the host. And I think everyone can sort of agree on this, is that where podcasts stand out is that the person who is listening is fully engrossed into what you're offering them as value within your content. The listener is coming back week after week after week and is completely loyal to the host and what they're saying. So when you're advertising something like even a pair of socks, it doesn't come off as an in-your-face advertising, but it comes off as a referral from a friend, because you're listening to this person day in and day out. And that's the sort of merits that come with the podcasting space. And then there are various manifestations that come into podcasting, such as pre-roll advertising, mid-roll advertising, which is just stitching ads within the content, or host-read endorsements. And I think a lot of podcasters in India have now experimented with host-read endorsements, and we sort of drive that with brands as well. And finally, you have the sponsorship, which is sort of sponsoring and branding a piece of content with the brand's messaging.
I'm curious, what did you sell to the mattress brand?
So it's a very funny case, because a lot of podcast listeners here would actually know Casper mattresses. And they wouldn't know them because they've seen them or felt them or slept on them. They would know them because they've heard them as a podcast ad. And it's just, the recall is so high because I've never felt it, I've never seen it, I know it's a mattress in a box. Why do I know that? Because I've heard it in podcasts all my life. And that's sort of where the mattress brand came into the picture.
I was wondering, would any of you have considered starting your own podcast? Anybody in the crowd? Not at all? Okay, we're seeing some. You don't have to be shy about this. If the thought has crossed your mind, starting a podcast. Okay, yes. So Naga here is an independent podcaster, and I was wondering, Naga, you have complete control of your product. You are creating it, you're calling up your own people, you're hosting it, you're distributing it yourself. what sort of, as an independent podcaster, what sort of challenges do you see, but also what sort of advantages do you have?
So in terms of the challenges, I think the first one is making the time and being good at all of these different aspects, right? So there are various steps to creating a podcast and format, kind of people you want to get on the show, what are you going to talk, how long it is. So first one is the conceptualization stage. That's when a lot of us get stuck. And I myself stuck because I'm trying to start a new podcast, but I'm stuck with so many questions that I don't know how to go about. So the first challenge is, how do you get the answers that you need, right? The answer is just talk to me and then she'll tell you what to do. But yeah, so, and so that's the first bit where you get stuck, which is the conceptualization. The second part is taking that idea and that wonderful concept and executing it, because everyone has an idea, everyone can do what you do, but how do you stay consistent? Like Aman mentioned, consistency is that secret, not so secret sauce here, because you have to be consistent, not just in terms of putting out episodes, but consistent in terms of quality, consistent in terms of the kind of conversations you're having, the length of the episode, the theme that you're trying to contain. So that is the challenge. And to come back to the same topic with the same level of freshness and rigor that you once did, because it kind of gets monotonous. So you need to keep reinvigorating yourself to say that this is the reason I'm so pumped up about this, because if you're smiling on the show, people can feel it. And if you're upset, then people can feel it. So that's the intimacy that the medium carries. But again, that's the challenge. So just the execution bit, because it involves so many moving parts, and if you're just one person, it's a lot to take on.
What's your favorite part of making your own podcast?
My favorite part is just meeting people and rubbing off that energy, right? Then you look at someone, and because I talk about passion, I talk about something that people do that they don't traditionally do. So my latest episode was with a microbiologist, and she talked about how she saw these piles of garbage on the slopes of the Himalayas, and then subsequently she read something about bacteria that can digest plastic, and she's devoted her entire life to it. And these are not stories that you can come across on a regular basis. Or another episode was with a mountaineer who's done the 7 summits across the 7 continents. So you're constantly around people who are so passionate and so charged up. So that's a great thing, right? And the last part is, it's just a fantastic networking hack. You can reach out to people and talk to them that you would have never
That's the business
spoken
model
to.
as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, right? Because for me, there's zero money in podcasting. It's only my feeling of self-importance, and that's good enough for me.
So, Sriraman, one thing we all tend to hear a lot is see, American podcasts, we don't compare because our quality doesn't compare. With English language podcasts, our comparisons are usually Serial, The Daily by the New York Times, so maybe This American Life as well. With regional content, I'm assuming your audiences are primarily radio audience. So how do you attract that sort of audience to maybe take the leap into listening to it online?
Fair enough. So, the previous one we were trying to benchmark the numbers of listeners, right? And she said there's no niche, which is nicely put, because if we were to look at a proxy, let's look at The Economist. There is about 7,000 readers in India, right? The Economic Times, maybe there's 7 lakh readers in India. And then let's look at an Amar Ujala, which is like some 7 crore readers in India, right? Now, the people reading The Economist, you know who they are, right? They could be really influential people, decision makers, etc., right? So now let me give you an example of that in Awaaz, right? We are audio archiving this whole event. I've been going after every delegate and speaker here and trying to, get the insights that they shared on stage in a guest and make it available as an audio. I'm sure this might get like 500 streams, but those 500 people could be the whole radio industry, which could be a CEO of a radio station, right? So you can't say 500 because the Hindi jokes is like at 1 million, right? So there is huge amount of context built into this, right? So even when you are monetizing, we work with brands. There's a brand we work with to say mutual fund investor education. We built an audio fiction love story and put mutual fund inside it because the boy wants to say yes to all the wishes of the girl. So he starts investing in mutual fund, something like that, right? So that's the whole, it's a 10-part fiction. Ishq bhi, risk bhi, that's what it is called. Yeah, so that's what it is called. There's like 2,000 hours, like today you are skipping 6-second ads. I'm talking about 2,000 hours of content listenership for this. More than a lakh people, unique lakh people have heard this, right? Brand is super happy. We're doing a season 2 of it. So that's your somewhere in middle, right? And then there is, you open up to the whole world, which is not like this 100 minutes heavy, but much smaller pieces of content. So I do not know if I'm only migrating radio audience or anyone. Like we just look at people. Our content programming is inspired from humanity, as we call it. Like morning, you want to get quick 3-minute news. On your commute, you want to get stories. Like in between this, you want to get like a daily dose of motivation, like Suvichar, Aaj Ka Vishesh, all these kind of things. Evening when you're relaxing, again you got lifestyle, entertainment, stories, very immersive stories like Dadi Ma Ka Kahaniya, all this kind of stuff. So it depends on the context, how big this number is, and based on that number, you go to a particular brand, and you also try to monetize the user's time and attention meaningfully. Like, do not insert jingles and disrupt the whole immersive experience of audio, right? But if you can weave the brand into it contextually, like the best example I keep saying is Coke Studio. They could put ads on MTV, but they created such beautiful content. Even after the show ended on TV, we keep going back to YouTube and we keep listening to Coke Studio content. Right, so there's art in it. If we do it well, monies do follow, because unlike he who does it for passion, I have to pay bills. There's 30 people working, right? They have all EMIs dependent on us, so we take it a lot more seriously in that sense.
I think we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you also, when we were growing up, we were listening to radio, we had these RJs, it felt like they were talking to us directly, it felt intimate. They had a sort of community around them, we could call them up. How do you build audiences as a podcaster? How do you build that intimacy?
So being like someone who's obviously come from a radio background, I've been so used to the idea that like anyone can call you, you can pick up that, that call, or you get SMSs and so on. And now it is literally social media. Like that is like the key way in which like I think everyone is building any kind of audience. And I think it's crazy to think that like even when I was on the radio, and I'm sure like some of you guys may have experienced this a little bit. I don't know if it's happened to Naga yet. But you have this moment where like someone on the street will just be like, oh my God, I'm a huge fan. Like I was in the airport in Bangalore and this dude was sitting opposite me was like, I listen to your show and I love it. I think it's amazing. And then as like, because there's not enough, I was talking about not enough information about the industry, I start like doing market survey and all that. I'm like, okay, so how many hours of podcasting do you listen to? And then suddenly like every person that I meet who tells me I listen to your podcast, I'm like, okay, 1 minute, I need to do a market survey. Because like, there's just not enough information. And because you feel, and I genuinely think that there is some level of like loyalty with podcasting, right? Because there is like a higher retention value. There is this ability that, you know what, I have people who are listening to me for a whole hour. Like for all the shows that we've made so far, the most amazing thing is that I've had conversations with TikTok where they're telling me attention span of people is 15 seconds. And I'm telling people that the completion of our show and our retention is 25 to 35 minutes is just like that 95%, completion rates. And you're like, how... This doesn't like to tell me one thing and then realize that actually I'm experiencing something totally different with podcasts. So one of the things about building that audience, and I do think it's absolutely possible, is like there are things that like I run my own show plus I run a network. So talking about passion and doing it like an indie music show, I started a merch store. I just decided like let's start a merch store, like let people buy T-shirts and coffee mugs, and why not? And then I'm walking into a music festival and I spot a dude wearing my T-shirt and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so happy. So I think we have the ability to create like what's different about podcasts is loyalty. And I think that's what like we value over and above just like the numbers game, which I hate having to say. I hate saying like numbers, but it is loyalty, man. Like that's my thing about podcasting.
We have a friend called Sharanya who speaks really loudly, and she's at a cafe one day and then somebody taps her on the shoulder saying, I can recognize you by your voice. See? So I'm like, oh, we've made it. I think, okay, guys, I was wondering if the audience has any questions for our panelists. We are a little short of time.
Like you've talked about loyalty. So how much have they listened to? Is there a way that you're tracking it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of the data that you would get from I'd mentioned Libsyn, a lot of the data that you would get, like from Apple and Spotify and so on, they will literally tell you for how
The
long
number
they've
of-
listened to a
Okay.
show. So
Okay.
it'll tell you like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and so
Okay.
on. Where they call it drop-off rates.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't
I
it mean-
wanted to know, how do you know when a series needs to end? And also, because I work at a at a publication where we do videos and we do a bunch of other stuff. So how do you convince people that podcast is the good medium and not like doing it on a video or something? Like if you guys have like similar challenges, this was actually for Naga. So
This is Shelly from Quartz?
Yes.
Yes.
from Quint actually.
Quint.
I was at once.
So I don't really have much experience trying to convince B2B brands, right? You should talk to Bijay, who's there, who does this. But the reason that just adding on to what Nishant said, the reason a brand should come to audio is A, for differentiation, B, for the storytelling power, right? And this is one of the questions that Neha had asked, but we didn't really answer. Was one of what was, why do we need to convince brands to invest in audio? It's not spend in audio. See, the word is invest in audio because the returns don't come that easy. The brands are very used to instant, an insight data. Your CTC, your consumer acquisition cost is this much. Your conversion cost is this much. Podcasts give you no such metrics, but they have great storytelling value. And if a brand is willing to invest and spend that much time, then that's your answer.
Can we do podcasts for a living? All of us are doing.
Again, Bijay, talk to Bijay.
But is there? Do you want to answer that? Are we eating? Are we?
See, right now, I can tell you for sure, and it's what Aman had mentioned as well, that like we're at like that crest of a wave, like it's just starting, right? And I do think that like all of us are making some kind of living, like making podcasts or being part of the podcasting space. There is a possibility to make money, and there are various ways in which you're doing it. Like, I mean, Sriram, you were like talking about like literally that, like a mutual fund that like, and they're making podcasts. There are brands that are willing to, and they're like, it's this thing of like even ad agencies are approaching us to be like, when we ask about podcasts, we have no idea what to say to them. And I do think that we have the ability to make money from podcasting, whether it's through advertising or host mentions, or as in radio, we call it RJ mention. It's just that we move that around a little bit and be like host mentions now. There is a possibility that people can make money, but it is going to take some time. And as you said, we aren't able to measure the impact of what it'll be, but for a lot of brands, it ends up being a great mouthpiece for them. Like, yeah.
Just picking up from the measurement piece, and I think it goes back to the last question as well, but brands shouldn't be looking at this as something that they can measure, right? Brands should be looking at this, as Naga rightly pointed out, with the notion that it's a great branding strategy and it's a great storytelling strategy. It's how you get your brand out there. Now, tomorrow, if a PR sort of article comes out, how are you actually measuring your conversion rates from that, right? That's what differentiates a sort of online digital marketing strategy from a branding strategy. It's not the conversions that you get, it's not the sales that you get, but it's the brand that you're building, and that takes time with sort of podcasting as well.
I want to thank you all for being a really fantastic audience. I think these guys will be available outside as well if you want to ask more questions. But thank you again. It was great to be here. And we'll sign off like we usually do. You can find us on any podcast apps. You can find us on YouTube. You can please like, please subscribe. We need to eat. Thank you so much.
One camera at a time, which one? Red one? Red one, yeah. The last one.